I'll just give you while she's doing that. Most of you know my name is Barron, San Diego. I'm with the Peace Research Center, but a lot of what I'm going to present to you today about the border wall situation in San Diego is actually coming from American Friends Service Committee in San Diego, which their main focus is on the border militarization. And they've been working on that for, I think, over 30 years now, if not longer. So we do have a PowerPoint that they've created, and I brought some materials. But one of the things, and I've been doing detention work for over 20 years. I was active in New Jersey. We did a lot of work with detention within the country, and so this now I'm getting experience with the wall, that increasing barrier to human movement across the border. As we talk about the wall and the billions of dollars being poured into the wall, it's not about keeping people out. It's not about stopping that flow of people. It's about keeping U.S. citizens enclosed, separated. It becomes, this physical barrier is causing a psychological change in U.S. people's minds about the outside as scary, as a place of terror. We always hear about the drug cartels in Mexico. It's scary to travel down there. We'll start, once that happens, once that really gets fixed, you'll start hearing about problems in Canada. So we are going to create this very controlled environment, and the only place you're safe is inside. So I really do see this, because you're absolutely right, the borders are porous. They're meant to be porous, but controlled. Right? Mm-hmm. Controlled by the government. And then there's a psychological effect that I think it really is really starting to percolate into my mind. Because when they put up so let's talk about, we're really talking about the San Ysidro entry point, which is the most controlled. And that's between San Diego and Tijuana. And that's the San Ysidro entry point, and that's the one that's the most controlled, and it's also the one that's most visible, you know, in the world. That's that when we think of the border, we think of there. How many walls are at that border now? No clue. Well, when Nancy Reagan came down and set up that Friendship Garden, there were no walls. Mm-hmm. And then soon after that, there was one wall under Bill Clinton. We're talking really, and these, I'm going to pass these out. Okay, there are literally two walls now, right next to each other, running parallel, with about 6 feet between them. And with Trump's new wall, we're going to have 3 walls running right across from each other, running parallel. So we already have a wall, now we got 2 walls, now we're going to get 3 walls. And the purpose of the walls is to we want to think about it. So I'm going to leave that as, yeah.
So this is the wall here that goes out into the water? That's like the craziest, I remember.
The wall extends like, I want to say, I can't remember exactly, but it's definitely a mile into the ocean. So international waters is 20 miles off.
The water is over most of it, isn't it?
It's crazy. And the interesting thing about this too is that Trump's first action wasn't really, when he got in, was to expand the Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol has control over 100 miles from every border, which includes seashores. So the Border Patrol actually technically has control over about 80% of the US population, because most of the US population lies over. Now, legally, Border Patrol can't interfere with a US citizen on US citizen soil. They can ask us questions and we can just keep going. By law, we don't have to respond to Border Patrol. Border Patrol also is one of the few, it's heavily militarized now, and there are no oversight of the Border Patrol, absolutely none. If you get beaten up, and we see this over and over again, if they take your rights and stuff like, there's really nothing set in place no official capacity, like they have a district attorney over police, things like that. But the Border Patrol is the one thing that really has complete authoritarian right to do whatever they want with no oversight or accountability. And that's why he's bumping up the Border Patrol. Because even if you're a U.S. citizen, because we're seeing U.S. citizens now being stopped by Border Patrol, harassed, deported, beaten, and no accountability. So this is the video that's been playing up here. This happens once a month in San Diego. It's on the 26th of each month. It's outside the Mexican consulate, and what she's doing there is she's been creating so each time it's some kind of art project, and what she's drawing there is one of the 43 students who disappeared from the state of Ayotzinapa. So Ayotzinapa, the students disappeared almost 2 years ago now, or 2 years ago now. They haven't been recovered. There's been no information about what happened to them. At the time, it was said that they were taken away by drug cartels, but we know it was paramilitary that came in and took them away. The thing to know about this school is this school, they train teachers. So all of these students were training to be teachers, and not just any teachers. This was a revolutionary school. These are teachers
so there's a reason they were disappeared.
These teachers teach truth. They teach true history. They're like the Howard Zinn, Mexican version of Howard Zinn. And the guns that were used, because some of the bullets were recovered from the gunfight that happened, students weren't firing, the soldiers were. Those guns were linked to U.S. guns that disappeared through that whole, what was that, Operation Firestorm or whatever it was called. There was an operation where supposedly the fire guns control group was trying to find out who were the guns runners in Mexico. So we lost billions of dollars of guns in that mistaken operation into Mexico. And those guns ended up in Mexico being used by the paramilitary to further the terror on indigenous peoples and people who are trying to revolutionize their lives, you know. So it was just evocative to see her create this face on what was just cement half hour earlier. And so we want to me, this is the artwork. It's so important, is to bring these narratives alive, that this student is intimately connected to U.S. policies and that border control. So the border is incredibly porous. The biggest flow of guns is through the Texan border down into that state. I forget the name of the state, maybe Sonora. That's just south in Mexico. And that's also the highest rate of femicide. There's a huge epidemic of women disappearing or being found dead. They found over 100 bodies recently of young women brutalized, raped, tortured, and found dead. And so wherever you see this kind of like U.S. operations, military operations, total devastation is follows that. You'll see especially attacks on family structures. Women are the basis of a family unit, and so they go after the women especially to break that kind of community tie, because that's what, if you can break that community tie, that's how you can decrease the resistance in that community. So you're right, the wall is completely porous, but it's also completely controlled. Yeah. So are there any questions or any thoughts before we watch some of like your basic information about the work that's going on in the U.S. militarization of the border?
The three walls? Which side of the political border are the three walls?
That's a moving question. That is a really good question, because the border actually, I don't know where the border is. So, and that's why there's been the debate over who pays for the wall, right? Because we keep trying to build the wall into Mexico so we can take that land, right? So it's like border walls fight. But yeah. And then even though they want to have, Trump's calling for a wall across the whole border, there are places actually you can't build the wall. It's just physically impossible. And also those are left open for wildlife and for habitat to go back and forth, because There are certain places where there has to be that flow of a natural corridor, a green corridor. So they're not going to build that wall anyways. It was under Clinton that second wall was being built, and that second wall was done deliberately. It's kind of a very frightening story for me, thinking that it was done deliberately. And this was under the Clinton administration, completely with, his support. And that was to create a funnel where the wall was built on the eastern and western sides of the desert, and that meant that everyone was funneled into the desert. And so most of that portion now is through really deadly territory in the summertime. So we have over 6,000 people who have died crossing from the south into north since Clinton time, being forced through this inhospitable desert. And so you'll have groups like Angels Without Borders and Operation Water Drop that will go into the desert and put up these little areas for supplies. And then you'll have either the militia groups like the Minutemen or the Border Patrol come through and they just shoot it up. They don't even take it. They just shoot holes in the water canisters so that you come to the water canisters and you see that there was something. It's really just, they don't even take the water. They just shoot it up. So yeah, if we want to, I was going to share this with you. This was created by American Friends Service Committee that does the border militarization project. So this was a presentation in Barrio Logan, which is like the heavily Mexican-American, Hispanic, Latino part of San Diego. I mean, it's all heavily there's a huge Latino population throughout all of San Diego, but this one specifically, really, when you go there, it's the whole community. You feel sometimes like you're in really vibrant parts of Mexico. And it's called Barrio Logan. Union del Barrio in San Diego works very closely with American Friends Service Committee, and then and they also do a lot of ongoing work about observing and documenting the militarization of the border. So I'm just, oops, why isn't it going? Maybe I need to click.
It has like that start video thing is X apps that you have to.
No, it's not a video. It's just a. I'll just see if I can. She just showed me how to toggle it. Oh man, this is what I always do. Is there another one?
That's why I don't do these things.
I know, really, right?
So inept.
Next, I can go next. I know, really. I don't want to end show. I want to go to. All right, so definition, the border militarization. And again, I want to say that when I first moved to San Diego, moving at least down in, if I was going into Mexico, there was no obvious militarization or any border patrol presence at the border. You had, for people coming into the country, there was a place that they had to stop at. You had the border control point, and people would check their passports, and also in San Diego, a lot of people didn't use passports in those days. This is back like 1979. We didn't even use passports to cross back and forth. You just had sometimes day passes, things like that. If you were Mexican, US people, we didn't have to show anything. We just went back and forth freely. But if you had darker skin, oftentimes you would be asked to show documentation, but you weren't required to show a passport, and there was none of the stuff that you see now. And it was a pretty sleepy crossover point. You didn't have the tons of trucks and tanks and just you'll see as we move through it. I'm just trying to figure out how to do this. Oh, there we go. So border militarization, what does it look like? So what you're seeing on the left-hand side that's training for the Border Patrol. So the Border Patrol now has become a war zone. Whereas before it was simply to make sure that people weren't bringing in fruits, vegetables, or weren't bringing in drugs. Drugs, of course, was the big thing. They would often check for drugs coming into the country. They never checked for drugs going out of the country. But now you're starting to see in the training, the border militarization starts with the training. The training of the Border Patrol is heavily militarized. They're giving military-style weapons. They have, so to become a Border Patrol agent, what do you need?
I bet there's a standardized test and you can't score above a certain point.
Above a certain point?
With the London police,
Yeah.
they didn't allow a guy to be a cop because he scored too.
Well, did they move him into being a lieutenant or just?
We were a joke on the night show.
Oh, that's funny. So now we're starting to bring in Department of Defense, or I like what you say, Department of War, so I'm going to start using that now instead of Department of Defense. Equipment and training. A lot of the training there, co-training now, we're seeing co-training between the Border Patrol, San Diego Police Department, with Mossad from Israel. So San Diego Police Department are one of the city police departments across the country that are getting some training from Mossad of Israel. So that means that you're starting to look at people as potential threats.
So Mossad is like the secret police of Israel, or?
Yeah, that's like so Mossad is the secret police, but they're part of the defense department within Israel. And so their job really is to investigate and keep terror out of Israel. They do, the main function is to focus on keeping Palestine tightly contained, making sure those walls are not porous. And so what we're seeing now is a bleed over between the same corporate entities and state entities that support Israel's apartheid is now heavily involved in supporting U.S. border entries. So you'll see that as we talk about the wall, right now there are 4 bidders now that have been successful and moved to the next stage of building the wall. So the Homeland Security put out bids. I think there were something like 15 or 16 companies that said, yeah, we want to build the wall. Hi, welcome. Hi. That want to build the wall, and they've narrowed it down to 4. One of those 4 is actively involved in building the walls in Palestine and securing those walls. We also have IT companies like Hewlett-Packard that are heavily engaged in the data entry and tracking people coming in and out of Israel and Palestine. And they're also heavily engaged with U.S. police departments and prisons in the United States. So you're really seeing this blending of what should be just local internal policing and a militarized approach where everybody is a potential enemy. So we never really had community policing. I always love that term when we talk about the United States, oh, the old community police. We never, ever had community and police. It was always an occupying force, but there was some, because they were locally based and didn't really have a whole lot of equipment and weren't trained together. But now, I'd asked before what you thought Border Patrol agents need in order to be Border Patrol agents. There are no qualifications or training to be a Border Patrol agent. None. You need more to be, at least to be a police officer, you have to go through a background check, things like that. Fingerprints, you have to take at least a 6-month course, if not more, and you have to pass certain of the course. Right, but with the Border Patrol, there's none of that. What we would love to, and because it's considered national security, Border Patrol is wrapped under Homeland Security, we can't get in any information if you do a Freedom of Information request, because what we're really interested in is finding out how many of the Border Patrol agents are veterans coming back from the Mideast wars.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are they selected for having good PTSD scores or something like that?
Well, that's the test we need to, and can you write that down, because we really want to come up with some strategies. I mean, the American Friends Service Committee, in their study, they did a study that was funded by the Quakers, and it's called On the Borderline, Abuses at the United States-Mexican Border. And this really captures the extent and the horrible increase in the number of abuses committed by Border Patrol. And it's more by actually customs officials than it is Border Patrol, shockingly. We thought it would be Border Patrol, but it's the customs officials, which is a slightly separate department. And so you're seeing like a lot of sexual abuse of people going through the border, physical abuse, taunting, bullying, and things like that. And so they talk about that in here. And you always see that whenever you militarize anything, aggression, bullying, assaults, sexual assaults, everything like that goes up through the yin yang. It's like Okinawa, right? The sexual abuse of the women there by the US soldiers is skyrocketed. So there's a lot of rapes, which is, I think, catalyzed a lot of the protests against the,
Yes.
Yeah. So we're seeing that here along the border too. And again, it's increasing because you can see again on the Mexican side of the border, the huge increase in femicide, like the numbers of women that are just disappearing and ending up in mass graves south of the Texan border, and makes us wonder now too what's happening north of the border. We see huge increases in domestic violence north of the border, along the border. So very closely related. So feel free to add to this or add questions or as we go into it.
Isn't there a native tribe in Arizona that is resisting having a wall go through it? I've read that.
It's in both places.
Around Tucson, something, that area, or maybe east of there.
There's the Tono Oldham, I hope I'm saying that right, reservation, First Nation in that area. So that might be what you're talking about. That'd be good to follow up on. Oh, my postcard.
What happened with the Border Patrol agent that shot a Mexican kid across the...
Nothing. So that was in Nogales. Actually, there have been several incidents of that happening. The most egregious was in Nogales because the kid was so young. He was 14, I want to say. His name was, I want to say, Jesus. And so we were at that site at the Nogales gathering last year because there was a vigil at that site. And so you could see where the shot took place. So from the American side, the Border Patrol, U.S. side, the Border Patrol agent was standing up on a hill that really towers up over the wall at that point, and it's quite a huge distance down to the teenager was standing on the sidewalk in Nogales on the Mexican side. The Border Patrol agent says that he threw a rock at him. That's why he shot him. Nothing happened to that Border Patrol agent. And that was under Obama. So, you know, when Trump won the selection process to be president, a lot of people like in Barrio, Union del Barrio, and a lot of these Latino groups, we have the Zapatistas in San Diego. There's a group of Zapatistas, you know, all these different Latino and Latina groups told us it made no difference to them. Between having Trump in and having Obama in made no difference to the board. It made it worse, but it's like going from 100 times worse to 1,200 times worse. I mean, there wasn't like a huge upswell. And even while everyone's talking about the detentions and the deportations and the ICE raids, it really is not more people being deported. What's interesting is the targets who are being deported now. The target has switched under Trump, but the numbers pretty much have stayed the same. And so for them, the choice between Trump and Clinton was nothing, because even under Clinton, you know, that's when you had NAFTA. So, and again, it's important to point out that that wall that went in under Clinton was during the NAFTA thing. And so when NAFTA was passed, that just pushed a whole lot of American corporations into Mexico. And part of the deal was that all of the Mexican government could no longer subsidize or support the small farmers. They all lost their lands, and so they were pushed to the border to Tijuana. And that's when the militarization of the border really began, because they wanted to control that flow. They didn't just want it to be open so anyone could come over. Really, they wanted to control the flow so that they can control the labor back and forth. I don't know why, but I'm sure they have it better. So this is what it looks like. You can see that the border walls from nothing, now you're starting to see more kind of weird stress being placed on it. There's cameras along it. I don't know if the cameras have ever done any good. The only time the cameras ever worked in that could have done any good was there was a murder of Anastasia Riojas, and that was in San Diego, but right at the border. He was coming in from Tijuana. He was coming into U.S. He'd gone back and forth. He went back and forth repeatedly. He was a Mexican national, but he had family in the United States in San Diego. And so the cameras actually caught what happened. So he was coming in with his truck as he normally does. He gets stopped by the customs official who takes him out of range. He takes him out of the truck and out of range of the camera that's in his office, you know, right where his port of entry is. And then for some reason, the next thing we see is they must have forgotten the other cameras along the walls, because then all of a sudden you see in another section by the wall, he is surrounded, this man is surrounded by about 10 to 12 border CHP or the customs officials, and they killed him. I mean, they beat him to death on video, and we have that video. And they were found not guilty, or they found that they were working well within the limits of their of parameters of what they're supposed to do. And that was again under Obama from the Department of Justice. That was when Eric Holden, I'm forgetting his name. Yeah, it was it. So again, you're seeing like these massive human rights problems, and the Obama administration just going along business as usual. So when Trump got selected, there wasn't like a whole lot of, oh no, in parts of Southeast and
Are there lights also on these?
yeah, they can turn them on and off at will. Usually they're bright lights. Yeah, but you know, there's not on the U.S. side. There's really not a lot of housing or anything along those walls. We do have several people who talk about as children. They used to do these raids back in the 80s, where you would have Border Patrol, not ICE so much, but it was Border Patrol and it was customs officials literally running through people's backyards in Barrio Logan, in San Ysidro, tracking down what they thought were suspected people across the border. And so you would have those kinds of raids with bright lights and stuff that they were holding with their hand. There are bright lights here, but there's very few houses around it. So, I mean, it's just open fields, at least on the U.S. side. And the bright lights don't show they don't shine on the Mexican side. And then harassment is incredible and intense. We see, and this is why, again, I mentioned that Trump bumped up the number of Border Patrol by 5,000, because they're using them as security in San Diego. So even though we have the right to say, if we're a U.S. citizen and a Border Patrol agent comes up to us and says, show me your papers, what do you say to him? What do you say to him?
I don't know the answer. Nothing?
No, because no, you don't have to.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, if a police comes up, you have to ask the cop if you're being detained, and that creates a little conversation. But if you're not being detained, you can walk away. With the Border Patrol, you don't even have to ask that question. You can just walk away because you're a U.S. citizen. But what we're seeing now is that people with more melanin in their skin are treated as if they're lying. And so if the Border Patrol thinks that you might not be a citizen, then they can use that as a reasonable cause for stopping you.
Point of clarification. So if you aren't a citizen, you are required to show your papers to whoever asks for them.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And so one of the things that the ACLU and other human rights groups have been saying is that citizens have to insist on their rights. Do not give up your rights when you're asked to by an officer. Know your rights and keep using them, because if you don't, you put other people at risk, more at risk. So when I'm asked by a Border Patrol agent, and I go through the checkpoints all the time, I'm asked to show my documents, and I'm asked where I'm born, and I keep saying, I don't have to answer your questions. So like in Texas, because I go across all over, Texas, usually I have no issues. The biggest issues I have are in Arizona, where the Border Patrol agent gets a little aggressive, but I have the privilege of my white skin. I was traveling with my mom once, and she got really, really agitated. He kept pressing me, and I kept refusing to answer. And my mom finally screams out, "We're U.S. citizens, God damn it!" And then he goes, "All right, you can go." But I use it to because another time we were traveling to Arizona, and I had in my car a young girl who was undocumented. So it was interesting. I had a documented man who was from Iraq, and I had a documented grandmother who was Oaxacan, and her two granddaughters, and one of the granddaughters was documented, but the youngest one was not. She actually was also the one who had the fairest skin of us all. And so when the Border Patrol stopped us, I answered his question. So he said, all Americans, it was late at night, he was shining his flashlight, and his flashlight paused in Irma Linda's face because she was quite distinctly Oaxacan. And he goes, "Are you all American citizens?" And I said, "You bet." I mean, like that. And he goes, "Okay, yeah. So you use it, at that time I used it, because why not? All right, so you're starting to see now the impact on human rights from the border militarization. 1999 to 2013, recorded migrant deaths and humane border water stations. So you can see the red indicate the deaths, migrant deaths. And again, this is an underreporting. So we're looking here across the whole border, California. Oh no, this is just the Arizona, I'm sorry, because Yuma's Arizona. So this is Arizona border. And you can see I've been talking about Nogales. Nogales is sort of right at the bottom where the Arizona border turns and straightens out towards Texas. And then again, this is underreported because you don't find them all. So we think the underreporting is at least 50% because the desert is huge. Now you're also looking at Phoenix. That's where our PAO was. So I'm kind of curious now. I want to see the next slide because remember, this is also under the reign of our PAO, where he really viewed people with browner skin as dispensable and used them to promote his own power.
I missed a little bit of this, but is there a wall all the way along?
No, and in fact, we were just.
Where is the wall? There aren't as many red spots.
Oh, well, actually, yeah, that's a good point. So the wall is porous for a couple of different reasons. And I was talking about it a little bit earlier that when Clinton put in the second wall along the border, it was a partial wall because really what he was trying to do, or they were trying to do, was funnel people into the desert. So this literally is that desert point that they want to funnel people into. That's all desert there. If you travel further west into California, that's all desert. And so they were funneling people away from the coastal areas, which are much more moderate, into the desert areas, basically deliberately creating a death trap. So those deaths could either be due to human, right? People like the Border Patrol or local militia. I mean, but exposure to is a big cause because a lot of times what they call the coyotes, the people bringing them in and smuggling them in from Mexico, don't give them enough information about the trap. They say, "Oh, it'll just be a short walk across the border," and that's not true. You have to go hundreds of miles, and so you need water. And so there have been The water drops, you can see those with the blue flags, and those were set up by a lot of groups on the US side that are human rights groups to provide water. And then the Border Patrol or the militia will come along and just shoot the water bottles. They don't even take, they just, right, and leave them there as a sign that. So now we're starting to see the impact of the Mideast kind of militarization coming to the borders. There's the drone. Now we've used drones before by the US government, but always for doing like environmental studies. But now you're starting to see the militarized drones. This one is not big enough to carry weaponry, but the next size up can actually carry a bomb.
And it's the exact same ones that they use
Yes.
in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Well, the ones that they use in Afghanistan and Pakistan come out of Creech, which is in Nevada.
Right.
Right.
So, yeah. I mean,
they
they're
use on.
deployed differently, but it's the same models
Yes.
of surveillance drones.
But I bring that up too because it's yes, absolutely, and it's just a switch to turn that drone from heading over to Afghanistan to heading south to the border. Cool story, and maybe Erica, you know more about this, but I had heard that the Seattle police had got a drone, and there was so much agitation by people in Seattle that they actually gave the drone back.
I don't recall about a drone. We've had a lot of incidents in Seattle where the police have obtained various surveillance equipment, including a Stingray, I think, cell phone surveillance device that they put up in Seattle and then claimed that it wasn't on. Like, why do you even have it if you're not going to use it? But yeah, I wouldn't. I'm pretty sure I recall that at the very least they were exploring obtaining a drone, and yeah. So.
Boston is looking into drones.
So now you're seeing the war come home. So hopefully, I mean, this will wake people up, and we do need to keep referring to that. Where I used to work in El Cajon, which is a little town where they have settled a lot of Iraqi refugees. We're at a farmer's market one day, and it was just some guy bringing in his private drone. You know, they sell these little commercial things. And all the US citizens were standing around looking at each other because all the Iraqis had dropped to the ground when they heard that sound. And it was just a compelling, and they were shaking. It took a long time to bring them back to some kind of.
There were drones in Maine a few weeks ago at Bath Iron Works when the Secretary of the Navy was there visiting. We saw two, I don't know which ones, but they were circling.
Yeah. And we've been seeing more and more drones now in action in San Diego and at Creech and coming around and checking this out. We're also sure too, I mean, it's not just the fact that they can watch us. From our experience at Creech, we're pretty sure too, they have long range microphones. Like they can pick up our sounds, our speech from thousands of feet away. So they were ready for us last year. They knew exactly what we had planned. And I'm sure it's because the drones were overhead and they could hear. So the hollow point, you know, how many bullets do you need and how big do they need to be? It just gets worse and worse. So again, I come back to my thinking that this really is done to intimidate people in the United States, to make us think we're under siege, this constant display of big military weapons to save us and keeps us afraid. So I've met people who've never gone into Mexico and will never go into Mexico because they think it's scary. Now the checkpoints can be anywhere 100 miles inland from the border, and that includes the coast as well. So they have a huge amount of territory that they can actually navigate in. I have fun on Amtrak because you'll see that's an Amtrak train. So when the Amtrak train goes through Rochester and Buffalo, that corridor, they come up and they'll go through the cars, not the sleeper cars, but the coach cars. They don't go in the sleeper cars. They go in the coach cars, and it's early in the morning and you're kind of groggy. And so I would follow them and say, you don't have to answer their questions. You don't have to answer their questions. So, yeah, it's fun. It's kind of, back that is like a joy to do that, because they're not going to shoot me on a, on an Amtrak train. I would be a little more hesitant if I was by myself in the desert with my free Chelsea Manning bumper sticker. But
So Amtrak is
Yes.
government owned?
no.
No?
Mm-mm.
It's private.
Mhm.
Somehow it's a government funded, it's partnership, yeah. So, but what about private bus companies that cross the border? I mean.
Oh yeah, you cannot. Everyone. So when you're crossing the border, or within 100 feet of the border, 100 miles of the border, when you're crossing the border, you have to get off the bus, and you have to take your luggage with you, and then you go through customs. When you're 100 miles within the border, they can board the bus and they can ask questions. And again, if you're a U.S. citizen, but if you're not a U.S. citizen, even if you have a green card, you have to answer their questions, like Erica was saying.
And do the private companies that own these forms of transportation, like, are they a target for us to say, don't let your customers be harassed by these people?
Federal law.
What might be interesting would be if there are people who pass out a kind of know your rights card
Yes.
for everybody going
Yes.
on the bus.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, these kinds of things happen. We have a public bus system that goes through the submarine base, and so they do the same thing on the sub base. And
Yes.
they have the right to board the bus.
And they
It's
do.
going on to their property.
And we have that same argument going on in San Diego, because right after 9/11, the ICE and Border Patrol were boarding trolleys, and they were checking particularly Somalian people's IDs. And so then we were told, well, the police won't work with ICE agents, but they have to work with Border Patrol as part, because the Border Patrol is. Anyways, they do work with them, and so they do the same thing. And they'll do, so you might even see a checkpoint on a trolley, which is a city-owned transportation. And we just passed. So, and I'm looking at the time, because I did want to talk a little bit of what San Diego's doing in response. So right now, the wall prototypes are being built. So I talked a little about that within 100 air miles. So you can see the swath that now Border Patrol can patrol. And that's 90% of the US population is in that swath.
All of Hawaii?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because everything's a border around
Yeah.
Hawaii.
Yeah, because it includes the international waters. So
You're saying 90% live
90% of the population live within Border Patrol
in that orange thing?
of the United States. Most of our
Because you're saying it's the whole border. It's
100 miles
not-
in. Yeah, so the whole northeast.
Florida.
Look
Yeah,
at
So
that.
I
it
would
covers
think-
every big city on
Yeah.
the west coast.
And
Right,
almost
Boston,
every,
New York,
every
yeah.
big city on the east
Baltimore,
coast, and a bunch of
Philadelphia,
the
DC.
bigger cities in between.
And now we're seeing a more increase into what our rights are. It used to be considered normal that we had rights
This
at
is
the.
2/3 up there. 2/3 of the U.S. population live within 100 miles of them.
Okay, that might have changed. Thank you. I was old information here. Thank you. 200 million people affected. Oh, that's the legal authority that we were just talking about. Someone asked about that, 1953. So what we're seeing now too is an escalation of attacks to your privacy. It used to be that you had rights at the border, but now they're taking the position that you lose all rights when you're at that border. You have your rights, what we call our civil rights, but not our human rights. And I'm really
That was
thinking
very
about
good.
what Loretta said.
Whoa, within 25-mile threshold can enter private property without a warrant?
That's Border Patrol, yes.
Right, so I live
Yeah.
in Boston, so
Yeah.
I live within 25
Yeah.
No,
miles.
but is that an ocean
Yes,
border?
it's
Yeah.
the
All
international,
the orange.
it's the international border, which is like 20 miles offland. So yes, you can enter private.
Is it
Yes.
Current. this is
Yes,
like-
yes. This is what we're talking about now. This is why he's ramping up the Border Patrol. They have even less
So this
oversight
would be a
than the
way
police.
to control.
Yes,
all
that's
of
what we're
us.
All of
saying.
us, that's right.
Yes.
Oh,
That's-
I watched the Handmaid's Tale and it's.
Yes.
Move to Kansas.
Yeah, well, now within 100.
That's also the area that's going to get wiped out by climate change too.
Yeah.
Is-
Oh, when
Yeah.
climate change happens, I'm moving to Greenland. move to Greenland. Da, da, da. Anyway, so yeah, and now we're seeing a degradation of our privacy because now they're actually taking, when you're coming into the US, they're taking your cell phones. Now you can refuse and they won't let your cell phone cross. That's a big controversy. ACLU and other rights, electronic rights groups are taking that on. But right now you can, so when we were going to go to Nogales, we were going to leave our cell phones because we were going into the Mexican side. Coming back, they would have the right to look at our cell phones. And so I was just going to leave our cell phones with friends on the US side. So now you see like a degradation of our US civil rights at the border, where before at least we had our civil rights at the border, now we have no rights at the border. And you're seeing that also a lot of airports, international airports are now being treated as border. Yeah, so that is gonna, that's not included in that picture, but if you add the international airports, which are now treated as border points, that 100-mile zone is also.
Yeah, because that's Atlanta.
Yeah, we're talking about Salt Lake City, which has an international airport. You don't see it, yeah. So you see the closing in. So the war is coming home. The military is definitely coming home. It's going to be walls everywhere.
So there was an article somebody recommends that if you're concerned about your phone being searched or seized because that you can reformat it before you leave, and that's some protection. Although people have ways of getting files and contact information and so forth, but that's one way of making it harder for if they do that. And some people have created shortcuts in case they're asked for their phone, then they just hit the button and it starts reformatting.
Yes, I left it. Oh, thank you. You have to show me.
How common is that they would ask for your phone?
They're doing it all the time now. No, at the border. Oh, right.
At that point of entry,
Yeah.
so there was a U.S. Legal, I believe it was a legal U.S. immigrant who came and was told to hand over his phone to. So that might have been customs, not border patrol. But in any case, they were just we don't have to let you, you just have to give us your phone. So
yeah.
But would it be more for people who, as you say, are immigrants or
but they're
American
going,
citizens?
They are going after activists, front and center. Anyone that they think they're not looking for terrorists, they're looking for activists. Mm-hmm. So that's the alert that we were getting, is don't take your phones with you at all. Do you wanted to say, or?
Yeah, do you know what was it in 1953?
What was what?
That established a legal authority for some of this stuff?
Oh, it was a law passed that established the Border Patrol as being, and the rules for entry into the country. Before that, it was very fluid. I mean, people came and went. You had passports, people stamped them, but it was 1953 that, and really that's the McCarthy era, right? Yes. So you're starting to see and that is done by design. You had McCarthy out there being the front man, and I always think about Trump now, because being the McCarthy, because McCarthy's doing all of this outrageous stuff, and people are focused on him, but that opens up the opportunity behind them to do stuff like this, because there was a brief flowering of democracy, and then boom, it gets shut down again.
And what was that woman's name that was speaking? She said people have been planning and well organized for decades, and this is another place where we see that that's true.
The Heritage Foundation was founded in 1971 or 72, and that's kind of the genesis of this whole reconservatization. But the American public actually is much more progressive. They're much more, I'm going to use it, but they're much more to the left than our electorates. These are some of the faces, what it looks like. School of the Americas watch, the young man, second from the left on the bottom row. That's the young man in Nogales, the teenager in Nogales. That was
so these are all people who've been killed by Border Patrol.
Mm-hmm. Or yes, this is done by Border Patrol that we know of for sure. Anastasia Riojas is right there. So there was a settlement, American Friends Service Committee. He's the second from the left on the top one with the baseball cap. His family had a lawsuit against the Border Patrol. They won the lawsuit and they got a monetary settlement, but there was never any acknowledgement that any wrong was done. So the American Friends Service Committee has developed in that booklet. They have 10 points that they want to change the culture and the protocols and the procedures of the Border Patrol. And one of the reasons that we do this workshop is we want people to understand it's not just at that thin line, that's the border. It's now 2/3 of the United States are being held under this kind of their domain. So it's important to understand. So just as in San Diego Women Occupy, we work very heavily on creating an enforcement, a citizens oversight enforcement board for police practices. We need a national one for the Border Patrol and ICE agents and a federal, which we don't have at all. There's just complete. So historical overview, I think we can, 1924 was when the Border Patrol was formed. Yeah, well, I love that picture, manifesto.
Oh, their values include respect for human life. Interesting.
Yes, but that
It's supposed to mean different things.
Yeah, what is human? I mean, that's really the discussion, right? So who defines human? So border enforcement framed around the drug wars. So we know the drug wars were induced by U.S. policies, and really it's part of that that decades-long strategy to contain the progressive movement. So you really saw the crack epidemic being forced upon the African-American communities in the poorer neighborhoods as part of that. So this was 2006, this was done, so post-Obama. So this is Operation Gatekeeper. This is the one really where they're forcing migration across the border into a very contained area that they can control the flow back and forth, and that's through the desert. There's the bridge into the ocean. That's so Tijuana is the beach. Tijuana is on the left side, and Imperial Beach is on the north side. It was done definitely, again, think of NAFTA coming in and NAFTA forcing people north to the maquiladores along the Tijuana US border. So they wanted to keep the labor in those horrible conditions. They wanted people to stay in those factories under terrible, just terrible inhumane conditions instead of crossing the border into the United States. So it was done deliberately, to force them into that funnel. That was controlling the workforce, the labor force. Okay. So quickly what we're doing now, we're looking to use art to bump up the activism on this. They're building the prototypes in the Otay Mesa area of San Diego, which is a desert-like part of San Diego. They have roped it off. It's now become what was used to be just regular land has now become militarized. It's now a military installation. No one's allowed entrance into or even near where they're building the prototype walls. The 4 walls are will be built, and then the government will choose among the 4 walls which company gets the contract. We were protesting outside a local company that put in a bid. It didn't get the bid, so we stopped protesting outside that local company. The San Diego City Council has just passed a resolution that says not only will we not engage with any policies that impact undocumented people, but we also, the city of San Diego will no longer work with companies that supply contract or labor or services to any of the wall operations along the border. So that was kind of a cool thing. And that was, again, thanks to a lot of work done by American Friends Service Committee and other.
So that's like a parallel to the sanctuary city stuff, that won't cooperate with ICE. What is this?
This one is an easy one because it's basically, you get to choose who you're going to work with as a city. This government can't force, the federal government can't force you to take a certain contractor. So what this is saying is that we're not going to use city dollars to buy supplies or services from any company or corporation that supports the militarization of the border. So that's kind of cool. So the community fractures, we're really seeing now deportations of activists, which we hadn't really seen before. And they've really been going after women, pregnant women, and putting them in horrible conditions in detention. It's become a rallying cry for the community. But we're also seeing a lot of miscommunication, especially through Facebook, because everyone's out there saying we're going to be out in defense of our undocumented brothers and sisters. So we'll get alerts that ICE is here and ICE is there, Border Patrol is there, and people go rushing there, and there's no action there. So we're seeing a lot of deflection through Facebook, and some of us who are conspiratorially minded think that it's done by design to kind of drain us of our energy. So we work closely with American Friends Service Committee and a couple of other grassroots groups, and we connect with them first saying, is this actually happening? Should we send people out there? And they say, no, it's not happening. So, all right, so it's a little past 3 and we're gonna go do our, as we go to our next. But any thoughts, please email us if you have any thoughts about strategy, about dealing with the militarization of the wall, how we can tie it into some of the work that we're all doing. That would be great.
You said you used to live in New Jersey?
Yes.
Where?
In Highland Park.
So I wonder, since New Jersey seems to be within that
Yes.
frontier area too, like if there's a way to connect like folks in Boston, New York, New Jersey, with folks on the Mexico border saying these are things that are affecting all.
Yes, we have to build that network. I mean, the best thing I feel is to use a network that's already existing, which to me is like the ACLU, the American Friends Service Committee, because they already, and the Quakers, because they have that network, and then hopefully that they can get that out into their community. So I know in Newark that this is all well known, and that's because there is a New Jersey coalition of advocates against detention. And so they spread that news, but we need to connect it up and down, like to Maine, all the way down to Florida. Yeah.
Just to say quickly, like what we did this morning, looking at divestment and this stuff, and I mean, the divestment campaigns that are in the news right now, a lot of them pertain to, to DAPL and fossil fuels, but all of this stuff is so interconnected, obviously, and it seems like it has to get out there. Like we just have to do our little small drop of water part, and it's really overwhelming in some ways, but in other ways, it's like, oh God, thank God, people are having success, and we can add to that success. Thanks for doing this. It was really
Great,
fun.
Yeah, you liked it. Yeah. The only thing, just to throw out one more thing, is that they're also doing this to really stand down or chop off dissidents and activists. So you think about that next time you're traveling.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. So I have a couple, there's some stuff that you can take that I brought with me if you're interested in getting more information. So feel free.